Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People Story. I've lived on my little farm for close to 30 years now. It's been in my family for generations, passing down from my grandpa to my dad and now me. The total plot of land is about 100 acres, with a nice-sized house, big red barn, grazing pastures, and lots of woods. It's a good piece of property that's provided well for my family. Most all my neighbors have been here a long time too. We look out for each other and help when needed. Folks pretty much know where their land ends and the next begins without having to look at property lines. That is, until Karen moved in a couple years back. Karen bought the old Johnson place, a rundown farm about a quarter-mile down the road. She was always snooping around the fences, peering through her binoculars at my land. You could tell she thought she was better than country living. One day out of the blue, she came pounding on my door saying how 5 acres of my north pasture was actually hers. "I don't know what you're talking about, lady," I told her. "I've owned this land the same as my family before me. Those survey markers ain't moved none." Karen huffed and puffed, but I shut the door in her face. A week later, I got a letter from her lawyer saying she was disputing the property line. She claimed there was a mistake when our land was surveyed decades ago, and she had deeds from the 1800s to prove it. I didn't pay it no mind, figuring she was blowing smoke. But sure enough, Karen filed paperwork to have the county send surveyors back out. I had my own people ready too, just to be safe. They spent weeks running lines, checking monuments, and poring over historical records. In the end, it turned out Karen was full of bull. The line was right where it always been, smack dab down the middle of my north pasture. But I should have known a rejection from authority wouldn't deter the likes of Karen. A few days later, I caught her trespassing on my land with a damn backhoe. She was digging holes and pounding steel stakes, prattling on about establishing her true property line. I let out a whistle that would make a train brakeman proud. "You get your Loretta Lynn wannabe ass off my land right now before I call the sheriff," I hollered. Karen squawked and screeched but didn't budge. So I got on the phone, and within the hour half the county was there to sort it out. Karen played dumb like she thought this was her land all along. After the sheriff read her the riot act, she stormed off in a huff, but not before spitting some venom about seeing me in court. I hoped that'd be the end of it, but this was only the beginning of Karen's bullshit. A few days later, I was out checking fences along the north pasture when I saw Karen driving a big chain through the woods. I hightailed it over and found her plunking down wooden stakes with plastic tape between them, marking out what she called her new boundary. "Karen, I'm not going to tell you again. This is my property, and you need to remove everything before I call the sheriff," I shouted. Karen rolled her eyes and smirked. "Go ahead, Tattletale. The line's been surveyed. This land's mine, and you're in no position to dispute that." I pulled out my phone and dialed cop. While waiting for the cops, I asked Karen what she thought she was doing. Her answer made my blood boil. "Running a small business, providing an outdoor recreation area for the community. I've already got the permits for construction." She smiled like a crazed cat with a dead bird. Sure enough, when the deputies arrived, Karen whipped out pages of paperwork from the county. She'd done her homework, getting variances and conditional use permits, saying she intended to build an eco-adventure park on her property. By the time our survey was done, she'd already cemented things in place. The deputies said there wasn't much they could do besides ask Karen to refrain from any further activity until the legal mess got sorted in court. They recommended I file an injunction immediately. So I called my lawyer and spent the next few months in and out of sessions with crusty old judges. Finally, we got a date set for the big showdown. Karen had hired some big city hotshot while I stuck with the same attorney who handled my dad's will. The night before the hearing, Karen's goons showed up in big F-150 tricked out like it was on Pimp My Ride, rolling coal and kicking up dust on my road. I could hear them cackling as they peeled out laughing at God knows what. The next morning, I rolled into the sleepy little courthouse ready for battle. Karen put on her best sweet Southern belle act, but you could see the poison underneath. Our lawyers argued back and forth, throwing deeds, maps, and records until they were blue in the face. The judge listened intently, asked a million questions, and took a long look at all the paperwork. Finally, he banged his gavel and declared that after reviewing all the evidence, the original survey from 1958 stood as the legal boundary. The north 5 acres in dispute had always and would continue to belong to me. Karen's face turned an ugly purplish red like an old eggplant. Before she could start shrieking, the judge warned her any further activity on my land would be considered trespassing and subject to prosecution. After we left the courthouse, I thought that'd be the end of it. But no, this was Karen we were talking about. A week later, I'm out fixing fence and notice a big backhoe parked along the woods line. As I get closer, I see Karen herself operating the thing, taking big bites of dirt and trees. I ripped off my gloves and stomped over, ready to tear her face off. "Karen, I thought I made myself clear this is my damn land and you need to get lost," I shouted. Karen smiled slow and menacing like a shark. "Why don't you just run on back home, pumpkin? Wouldn't want to disturb a lady at work." That did it. I pulled out my phone and called cop yet again. By the time the deputies rolled up, Karen had the excavator blocked in by a huge pile of dirt and logs she dragged over between us. She tried playing innocent, but it was plain as day what her game was. The deputies cited Karen for criminal trespassing and had the tow trucks haul her machine away. I pressed charges and brought her back before the judge. After reviewing the new evidence and my request for a restraining order to protect my land and property, he issued Karen a stern warning. Next time she set foot on my land without permission, it'd mean jail time. Finally, it seemed I could live in peace again. But this is a Karen we're talking about. She wasn't done yet. A couple weeks later at dusk, when I'm bringing cows in, my bloodhounds start barking like mad down at the north fence. I sprint over with my flashlight to find Karen building yet another fence, this time on the inside of mine. She claimed this new line was meant to protect her investment. I promptly shoved Karen off my property and called the law yet again. This time when she went before the judge, he'd heard enough of her antics. He found Karen in contempt of court, revoked her permits, and slapped her with a restraining order covering my entire 100 acres. If she violated it just once, straight to jail she'd go. It's been quiet these past few months, but I still keep a close eye out. You never know with the likes of Karen. She'll try anything to cause trouble. At least now, if she crosses the line onto my land, I know the law is on my side. This farm has been in my family too long for some city slicker to just waltz in and claim it as hers. Guess Karen finally realized that too, even if begrudgingly. You can bet I'll defend what's mine tooth and nail against the likes of her. The next one is a pro-revenge story. I used to work in an office. The kind of work isn't particularly important to the story, so just picture a basic office job. Every January, HR would send an email to all employees with the employee handbook. This included job descriptions, office policies, etc. Every year since the PDF handbook had been established, it would be named with the year following it to establish that it was different from the original and all other years. Any changes would be updated next to the section in the table of contents, so you could see what had changed from the previous year and familiarize yourself with anything new. Now with that background, let's introduce Karen. Karen had been with the company for quite a long time, about 10 years I believe. She was fine at her job, just fine. She would get things done, but not without making everyone else miserable in the process. She would ask questions that had already been answered and basically just waste everyone's time for fun. She was just plain nasty to people and tried as hard as she could to make everyone stay far away from her. The worst thing about her was that she always seemed to be looking for a fight or a reason to complain. She had threatened lawsuits a few times over any small thing, but would always just get over it and drop it because she knew no laws had been broken and it would never go anywhere. She'd comment on how she should sue basically every business she ever went to because she could live off the settlement and retire early. Over the smallest issues you can imagine. She did her job and we never had a valid reason to fire her, especially knowing how lawsuit happy she was, so she stayed. Karen's job description, as per the handbook, called for a bachelor's degree. Karen did not have a bachelor's degree but had been hired before that became a requirement, so she was grandfathered in. One day, a position above hers became open. A guy we'll call Terry had recently completed his master's degree after taking night classes for a few years, and since an internal promotion is typically better than an outside hire, he was chosen for the promotion. Terry had been at the company for about 4.5 years and was well-liked and great at his job. The new job required a master's degree in its job description, and since he was a recent grad, it was a perfect fit, and everyone was happy for him, everyone except Karen. Since she was constantly looking for something to sue about, She took it as a direct insult that she had not been considered for this promotion, that she was not at all qualified for. She immediately cried discrimination and told our boss her lawyer would be in touch. We were all perplexed, as it was very clear that this position required a master's degree, and given that she didn't even have a bachelor's degree, there was no way she could have been hired for the role. What we soon realized was that Karen had saved the original company handbook named Company Handbook, and had not bothered to open or save any new editions that were sent in the following 8 years. She just assumed no changes had been made and that it was sent every year to ensure all employees had it. If she had bothered to open the file, she would have seen the sections that said updated in the table of contents. Since Karen cried lawsuit a lot, no one expected much of this since it was a ridiculous claim. But sure enough, Karen gives her resignation letter via email, and it is scathing, about how she can't bear to work in such a discriminatory environment that would only promote men. When any higher-ups try to speak to her about this and clear up the confusion, she basically tells them to duck off and to read the damn email. I don't owe any more of an explanation. She basically goes full Karen. Not long after, a letter comes in from her lawyer asking for a settlement to avoid a discrimination case. What Karen hadn't realized was that our boss's sister-in-law owned a law firm. She didn't really take on clients herself anymore and mostly just managed the other lawyers of her firm. She was basically semi-retired. What this meant was she had plenty of time to review any letters from Karen's lawyer and advise us. Since Karen didn't bother to read any of the updated handbooks, she was unaware that this position had required a master's degree for many years now, I believe about 6 years. She supplied her lawyer with the original company handbook from 9 years ago, and he used that as a reference in his settlement demand. This was when we realized she hadn't read any new handbooks in years. Since Karen rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, the boss's sister-in-law decided to personally take on the case. Every letter Karen's lawyer sent, she sent back one 3 times in length. Some of it wouldn't even really say anything, just wordiness, but it would certainly take Karen's lawyer a while to read it, and he did not come cheap. After several of these letters, they realized no settlement was going to happen. They wanted to take it to court. It's a pretty cut and dry case. Boss's sister-in-law shows evidence that Karen has received all updates via email. After the change was made and the handbook sent out, HR even sent an email to Karen specifically, letting her know that she was grandfathered in and doesn't need to worry, to which Karen replied, "Okay, thank you," confirming receipt of it. The best part was when the bosses Sayel said that they couldn't break company rules to give Karen a job she was totally unqualified for while neglecting another employee who went above and beyond to get his master's degree to advance, as that would be unfair to all other employees. Karen now had a huge, seriously huge bill from her lawyer for all of these letters and filing the case, etc. No job, no one she could list as a positive recommendation, and no degree. In the time she had been at the company, it had become an industry standard to require a bachelor's degree, so she was effectively shut out of her career. It would also be hard to explain how you worked somewhere for a decade and don't have a letter of recommendation from anyone there. If she had only read her damn emails. The next one is a petty revenge story. I, a woman in her 30s, used to work at my local public library in the circulation department. I was the one who would check out materials for you. We had a nearby display table to feature books by authors for each month, like Irish Heritage in March and EdAPI in May. This incident occurred in June, so naturally we had books by LGBTQ+ authors. It seemed like every other day we had someone, usually named Kevin, complaining about it. By the end of the month, I had reached my breaking point. I was working with a wonderful queer individual named E, 20NB. Some Kevin was complaining to me within earshot of E, and it was the usual ugly anti-LGBTQ+ rhetoric. I followed the company's guidelines, trying to be polite and diplomatic. After he ran out of steam and left, I saw how uncomfortable E appeared. I vowed not to let it happen again. On my very next shift, another Kevin started complaining about our display table. I only wished that E could have been working too so they could have witnessed my petty revenge. I am a heterosexual cisgender woman married to a heterosexual cisgender man. I was about 6 months pregnant with our second child at the time. I had also just given my notice because we had bought a house in another town and were moving in a few weeks. I had the luxury of not worrying about any complaints that might result from my actions. But honestly, I would have done it anyway. Kevin and his wife approached my desk to check out their books. I engaged in my usual small talk and customer service chit-chat with the two of them, and they were perfectly polite. I noticed that his wife had a book that I had read. With my left hand, so they could see my wedding band, I gestured to the book, and with my right hand, I cradled my obvious baby bump and said, "Oh, my wife and I love this book." Kevin's wife, not a Karen, responded with an appreciative, "Oh, really? That's good to know." It truly was a good book. Kevin looked like an android that had just been shut down. He didn't look at me or say another word for the rest of the transaction. I bid them a cheerful farewell and had to hold back the giggles until they left. I had to explain the situation to another coworker who became very confused when I said the words, "my wife." By the end of it, he was laughing too. I only had a few more shifts after that and didn't get to tell E what I had done. I told a few other coworkers and we all had a good laugh. Aside from the occasional Karen or Kevin, it was a great job and I miss it. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So this happened when I was a teenager, around 18, 19, and I worked for this small bakery in my town. It's worth mentioning that I'm a woman. The owner was the worst man I've ever met. He had no business being around people, let alone managing employees. I was a key holder and the sole cashier of the store really early on. I was left alone to run the place and close it every day. He only gave us half-hour breaks for 10-hour shifts. He was racist and homophobic, and frequently made fun of his employees so his buddies could laugh at us when they visited. I can go on and on about this man, but the best summary I can give is that I saw 2 people quit on their first day while working for him. I told him I was leaving 3 weeks in and gave him a week's notice. He, of course, complained about how unprofessional I, the teenager, was being. I also specifically told him that I would not work the next Saturday. My last day would be Friday. Now I didn't want to work on Saturday because that was sandwich day. The day the entire building stops making cookies and pies and makes sandwiches to be shipped off to other businesses to sell. It was always the most stressful day because there was too much work and too few people to do it. Also because the owner, instead of lounging at the front of the store, had to work with me. And he had no respect for personal space. How close he insisted on getting bordered on sexual harassment, and no matter how many times I brought up how uncomfortable I was, he ignored or interrupted me. So I wasn't going to work on Saturday. Well, in my last week, I reminded him of this a few times, but he never seemed to get it. One day I asked him when I should give my key back, whether I should leave it in the store Friday night or some other time. He interrupted me and said I should give it back at the end of my shift on Saturday. He was convinced that my last day was going to be the dreaded sandwich day instead of Friday. I chose not to correct him, so I didn't. I locked up as usual on Friday, slept in the next morning, and wandered down to the bakery to give my key back. I walked in, and it was chaos. Customers were lined up. An employee who usually worked in the back was trying to man the cash register and failing. And the owner had gotten off his ass for once and was rushing around making hundreds of sandwiches, red in the face and swearing under his breath. I waved at him, but he made a point to look away from me. I put my key on the counter and walked out. He actually had to sell the bakery a few months later. Something about running out of people willing to work. I know I wasn't the catalyst for that particular development, but it's nice to know I helped. The next one is an entitled people story. In a previous life, I was a nurse, and one story always sticks in my mind. I was on a discharge ward juggling lots of patients, trying to get them home. Some came by ambulance, but the majority had to rely on relatives to come and collect them. Most relatives were fine with this, but the occasional ones made it very clear that collecting their relative was an inconvenience. We had an elderly lady come down to the unit to wait one day. She was a sweetheart, and we got along like a house on fire. I kept an eye on her throughout the day and ensured she had food and drinks. She kept apologizing for being an inconvenience to us. She told us that her son was very busy and important, and reading between the lines, it turned out that he rarely spent any time with her. "He's so busy all the time," she said. "I don't like to be a nuisance." She had been previously widowed and had no other children or relatives she could call on. It sounded like she led a lonely life, trying to be as independent as possible. This was her first time staying in the hospital. As the day wore on, I could hear the increasingly desperate phone calls she was making to him, trying to get collected. It wasn't hard to overhear him shouting down the phone at her that he was busy. Eventually, just before we were due to close, she called me over with an embarrassed face. "He's here," she said. "Oh, good," I said. "Is he on his way in?" Her face reddened and she said, "He's waiting in the car and told me to get to him, but I don't think I can walk that far." She looked exhausted and like she wanted to cry. "Give me a sec and I'll take you to him," I said. I grabbed a wheelchair, and while she nipped to the loo, I tucked a packet of sandwiches and crisps in her bag, as I didn't trust he was going to look after her at home either. We got down to the entrance, and she pointed out a supercar. Can't remember the type. I saw the boot open, but no one emerged from the car. I pushed her to the door and heard a gruff, "Get in," from the guy in the driver's seat. I helped the lady into the car, carrying on a cheery conversation to help cover her embarrassment, but also to make a point to the son. He didn't say a word or move a muscle as I wrestled with the wheelchair and his mother and deposited her things in the boot. I said goodbye to the lady, and he closed the boot with a button, revved the engine in apparent impatience, and roared out of the car park. It's not a very interesting story, and there was no comeuppance for the son, but even 20 years later, I often think about that lady and wonder how she got on. I know that we don't always know what's going on in anyone's lives, but he seemed so hard on her. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.